Okay, I'm going to stick with the same file that I was using when I showed you the transforms, but now I want to show you what I think is the secret weapon of the digital artist. And I think for this, I will come to my Fido layer and I'll duplicate that, make the bottom layer invisible. I'll work on the dinosaur layer instead. Because, look, if I come to my sketching, my peppermint, and I come and I choose the same color, if there's something in here which I'm not quite happy about and I want to adjust it, say like the back of a head, I want to make it longer, well, in the old days you'd have to draw something new here, and maybe rub out that bit, and there comes a certain point where you get a bit of a mess of eraser marks plus sketch lines in that particular area. Altogether it doesn't work very nicely. So I will double tap a few times to get rid of that. Instead, well, we've already seen how we can use the transform tool to warp or distort or increase or decrease various different areas of your picture when you use it in conjunction with the select tool. But, and I think this is kind of hidden away and I think it should be in a more prominent place. If you come to your adjustments icon, that's where I'm circling now in the top left, and I tap. I'm hiding away practically at the bottom of the list, minding its own business, is the Liquify adjustment. I'll tap on that and I get a whole load of buttons and sliders at the bottom. And you have 7 different ways to alter your picture. Let's take the one you're probably going to use the most. The one I'm circling now, that is push. And I can adjust the size of my brush here. Pressure is set to max, distortion is set to none, momentum is set to none. Now, if I come to that area at the back of the head, which I was sketching earlier, and I start pushing, you can see the size of my brush. It is big, but look at that. It's taken the back of the dinosaur's head and it's stretched things out. And then if I want to make my brush a little bit smaller, maybe I want to push the front of his snout forward a little bit like this. And maybe I want to make that horn bigger, but it's raising some of the surrounding areas. So I'll make my brush a little bit smaller and just drag up the tip of the horn. And so now, instead of me having to re-sketch in certain areas and erase other areas, I can now take my existing sketch lines or my finished lines and just pull them around like this. This is amazing. This is a really, really useful thing to have. And along with a few other things which I've said in Procreate, you get Liquify in various different image editing programs and art programs. I think the Liquify tool within Procreate is one of the best, if not the best, that I've seen. And there's one very good reason for that, and that is, in a lot of other programs, because this is a powerful function and requires a lot of processing power, you get a separate window with just the layer you're looking at and to adjust. And so that can make things a bit difficult to adjust one layer relative to another layer. But with Procreate, you see all the layers and you just get the Liquify tool popping up and doing what you want it to do. Okay, so I will come to reset just on the end where I'm circling and everything goes back to normal. Let's take a look at some of these tools. First of all, I'll start off with a couple of golden workflow rules. First thing is, you start off big and then you get smaller for the finer adjustments. Like supposing I want that to be a little bit knobbly, I'll make it even smaller. And I'll make my finer adjustments like this. Make it really small to get the individual knobbles and what have you, which maybe I want there. And I'll tap on reset. The reason being is if I start off small and start trying to nudge and nudge and nudge like this, I'm getting some very wobbly lines there. And then if I think, well, actually I wanted it to be bigger and I make it bigger, then those knobbles get dragged out. It is far better to start off as large as is reasonably practical, like this, and then go in and do things smaller and smaller and smaller. The other golden rule is if you're going to use this, the bigger the dimensions of your picture, the better the end result is going to be. This image is fairly small. Let me just check. I'll come to reset. And I'll come to my wrench icon and I'll tap on my canvas icon, crop and resize. Let's take a look at my settings. Yeah, this is 5,000 pixels wide by 2,854 pixels up. That is a large file size. And so I've got lots of different pixels, just say in this area here, to make my distortions. Well, if you have a much smaller file, you've got less pixels, and so because you're pushing and pulling them around and stretching things out and compressing things in, pretty soon you're going to start off with a rather blocky, unpleasant looking effect. So if you're doing something like construction, yeah, it's great. Look, let's come again to Liquify, make my size a certain size, and because it's a sketch, it doesn't really matter. I'm getting a good line because this is a large file size, but it doesn't really matter about the quality of that line. Let's tap on reset. But if I create a new layer, and I will come to inking, and supposing I've got syrup, and let's choose something dark, and is that going to be, yeah, okay. There you can see I've got my fine line. If I come to Liquify now, and I start to push it around, let's make it a little bit smaller. There'll come a certain point where, look at that. Once you push it beyond a certain point, you're going to get certain distortions. And that is not going to look nice if you have that finished line layer, which I did in the previous video, where you draw over the top of your construction lines to create a nice characterful line. So I think Liquify, yes, you can use it on more finished work, but if you do, be careful of any crisp outlines that you've got. Smoother areas of color, which gradually transition into each other, that's going to be less of a problem. The larger the file size, the less of a problem. But if you have a fairly small file with not many pixels along the bottom and going up the side, and you've got a lot of crispy artwork, then the Liquify tool may end up giving you some problems. I will tap somewhere else and I will get rid of that layer and come back to my Fido layer. Zoom out, come back to my Liquify tool. Now at the moment I'm using the push tool. That's probably the tool you're going to use the most. Make it a little bit bigger. Let's take the end of that tail and drag it up a little bit like this. Now at the moment my pressure is set to max, so I'll undo that and I'll make a light brush stroke and I get just a little bit of movement. If I come and I use my pencil, but this time I press much harder, things get dragged out much more. I will undo that. If I take my pressure down to about, say, what, 35%, I'll make a similarly hard brush stroke. And because the pressure was set lower, even though I made a harder brush stroke with more pressure, the whole thing moves much less. Personally, I find with that, I'll just normally leave it on max and just press very lightly if I want a little bit of movement, and suddenly press a lot harder if I want more movement. Okay, distortion I'll leave just for now, but instead I'll come to momentum and I'll set that to max. What that does is once you take your pencil off, the momentum will carry the brushstroke forward. So with the same area, let's make it a bit bigger. I'm pressing harder and let go. Did you see it carries on going a little bit beyond? I'll do that again. Pressure on and let go. And let go. It starts to give the brush a life of its own. So once you take your pencil off, it'll carry on going, depending upon how much momentum you have set. That, I think, well, it's not that much use for what we're doing now. It starts to become more useful when you're using things like the twirl tools, which we'll take a look at, because I'll take the momentum down. And now I will choose, let's try twirl right, and I'll make my brush bigger. And I'll place my brush just about where I'm circling now, where those two little spikes sticking out of the tail join the tail. And I'll take my distortion down to none. And then, oh, look at that. The whole tail starts twirling to the right. I'll tap on reset. And if I twirl to the left, now see if you can guess what happens now. It twirls to the left. I will double tap to undo that and come back to twirl right. But this time, I'm going to add some distortion when I do it. Okay, so distortion, look, let's just crank it right to the top so you can see what's happening. I'm going to press light so it gradually applies the effect. Ooh. You can see as it's twirling, it's also putting in various different distortions. And if ever you've seen a marbling exercise done in Procreate and you think, well, how did they do that? This is how they're doing it. It's the distortion slider in the Liquify tool. Let's tap to undo that. Let's take the distortion down a little bit, or quite a bit, and I'll do the same thing again. So now I'm getting it twirling, but I'm just getting some very light distortion added to the overall twirl to the right. So it's a case of riding these different sliders, get the effect you want. Now, if I want to get really silly, look, I'll take the momentum right up with the distortion right up, and I'll say stop when I let go. Stop. You can see it's got a life of its own, and it's doing all kinds of weird and wonderful things. Let's take momentum down and distortion down and tap to undo again. All right, just very quickly, if I come to push, and I'll make my brush size a bit smaller as well. Yeah, you can see as I start to pull, I got a little bit of distortion, just pushing and pulling the lines around. The distortion, well, it tends to have a bit more effect when you're not using the push tool, when you're using one of the others. So twirl right, twirl left, we've done. Pinch. Well, let's take distortion and momentum so they are off, so we just see the effect. Pinch is going to be a quite obvious one. There's my brush. If I come to the eye and I just rested my pencil against my iPad, and you can see it's pulling everything in so everything gets smaller. Tap to undo. And now I'll come to expand, and no, you're not going to get a prize for guessing what happens next, because I'll come to the same area, and this time everything gets bigger. Distortion is set for this particular slider, which I didn't check, so I will take that down, and then everything starts to bulge outwards, which is giving my dinosaur a bit more of a puppy dog look, which I quite like, so I'll keep it. Alright, crystals. There's no distortion set there at the moment. My size, make it fairly large. Let's just try a random part of the dinosaur. Let's take his thigh. Just draw along there. Can you see how I'm getting kind of crystally type effect? Let's zoom in. That's quite nice, but I'll tap to undo that. Let's up the distortion a little bit and see what happens with it now. Oh, now I'm starting to get some nice effects. Not so much for construction here, but if you wanted to create an interesting texture, then this is a nice way to do it. In fact, whoopee, I'm happy, so I'm going to do some more around here. And then I decide, you know what? I like it in some areas, but I don't like it in others. So rather than coming to undo, look, I've got a little brush here, a reconstruct brush. Distortion set to none, momentum set to none. That's what I want, because I want control with this brush. My size, I'll make it a little bit smaller. And now if I come to that whole area which I've affected, and I'll start off just around the front. Let's make it a bit smaller. The reconstruct just takes the area that you're brushing back to its original state before you called up the Liquify brush in the first place. Need I say how useful this is? Because, come on, with something like this, as well as being able to push the lines around, which is a huge help for construction drawing, sticking a bit of chaos in with the twirl or the crystals, well, that can get some interesting effects, and so it's nice to be bold. But take, for example, that lead. Supposing I want just the lead to be unaffected, well, I can just draw around where the lead is and take away the distortion just from that area, which I think is pretty useful. Okay, I will reset again, because the one I haven't taken a look at is edge. Let's make that just a little bit bigger. Now, supposing I wanted parts of the leg to be much thinner, I'm going to come to that leg which is at the back. I'll circle it now, and I'm going to draw up and down with this. Can you see how it's pulling the two edges into each other like this? If I undo that and come side to side, it's not really working. You have to draw along the area where you want to pull the edges in, like this. And if I wanted to come to the other leg, which is going more horizontally but slightly down, you can see what my brush is doing. It's just pulling things in as I draw along the two parallel lines. But now I suppose, oh, that's way too strong. Well, the brush I haven't shown you is adjust. And you get an amount slider. At the moment it's set to max. Watch what happens to that leg when I take the slider down from maximum. Ooh, that was before I applied the brush stroke. Now I can progressively apply the last brush stroke that I made. Anywhere between way over the top like this, nothing at all, or anything in between, maybe like that. And then when you decide, well, okay, that is absolutely fabulous, just come to any other tool and you're ready to start working again. When you are doing what I was doing here, where you're sketching out ideas, layers are your first friend, because you can put things on different layers. You can duplicate a layer and work it up some more and see if you like it, so you can be bold and not worry about messing things up. selecting parts of your layer like this so you can just concentrate on those. That is also your friend. And the transform tool is going to help you some more, like this. But then, of equal value, if I come to push, the Liquify tool is your other friend. And just because it's tucked away down in some menu, do not disregard it. Just be aware that it can start to distort lines. But when it comes to working out the details of whatever it is you're doing, this is a sketching revolution. And if you are sketching things out like this to construct or to work out a composition, please, please, please use these tools. You are going to find them so useful, and it's going to transform the way you work. All right, let's move on to the next video.